A housekeeper was accused of theft for a crime she did not commit. On the day of the hearing, a little girl burst into the courtroom to deliver a note that left everyone in shock. Lillian wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand as she carefully tidied up Maya's clothes scattered around her room. The 15-year-old girl, with curly hair and big brown eyes, watched the nanny affectionately. Maya loved Lillian like a second mother, something that often bothered Vivian, the Vasconcelos family's eldest daughter. "Lillian, you are the best person in the world. When I grow up, I want to be just like you," Maya said with a shy smile, holding a book. Vivian, at 18 years old, entered the room with a frowning face, her straight hair impeccably tied in a bun, and her green eyes shining with malice. She was a tall, thin young woman, always dressed in designer clothes, and wore an air of arrogance of someone who never had to fight for anything. "What are you teaching my sister? For her to become a little maid too?" Vivian said in a cutting tone, throwing her purse onto the couch as if marking her territory. Lillian swallowed the insult and continued organizing the toys, keeping a discreet smile on her face. She had a serene presence, with black hair tied in a simple bun, and brown eyes that revealed a mixture of sadness and hope. Her uniform, always clean and well-pressed, demonstrated her dedication to her work. "I teach what is respect and kindness, Miss Vivian. This is something we can all learn, no matter our position." Vivian snorted, crossing her arms. "Respect? From you? You barely know what that means." Bruce Vasconcelos, the family patriarch, entered the room shortly after. He was a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed grey hair, elegant attire, and a constant expression of coldness. He seemed oblivious to the affection between Lillian and Maya, focusing more on Vivian, his favorite daughter. "Is dinner ready? Or are you too busy playing teacher with my daughter?" Bruce asked in a deep voice, laced with contempt. Lillian hurried to answer, "Yes, Mr. Bruce, everything is ready. I was just finishing up here." Later that night, as Lillian was organizing the kitchen, Vivian appeared abruptly. Her face was contorted with anger, and her eyes shone as if she had discovered a dark secret. "You stole the necklace, didn't you? Don't even try to deny it. I knew one day you would show your true face." Lillian stood still for a moment before responding firmly. "I would never steal anything. That is not my character, Miss Vivian." Vivian let out a dry laugh, placing the necklace box on the table as if it were undeniable evidence. "You really think someone will believe your word over mine? What do you think you are?" Lillian took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I think I am an honest person, Miss Vivian, and I will prove it." Vivian's voice echoed through the house, attracting Bruce's attention, who entered the room with heavy steps. "What's going on here?" Bruce asked, his voice sounding more like a command than a question. Vivian turned to her father with a false victim expression. "Father, I found this in Lillian's room. She stole it." Lillian looked at Bruce with pleading eyes. "Mr. Bruce, I did not do this. Please, believe me. I would never steal anything from this house." Bruce looked at the necklace box on the table, and then at Lillian, his expression becoming even more severe. "And what do you have to say about this? Why was the box of this necklace in your room?" Lillian took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how it ended up there, sir. I swear on my life that I am innocent." Bruce crossed his arms, assessing the situation with coldness. "Innocent? The evidence says otherwise, Lillian." Maya, who had overheard the argument from afar, ran into the kitchen with tears in her eyes. "Dad, Lillian would never do that. I know she didn't steal it." Bruce looked at his youngest daughter, visibly uncomfortable with the intervention. "Maya, this is not a matter for a child. Go back to your room." Maya hesitated, but obeyed, casting one last supportive glance at Lillian. "Don't worry, Lillian. I'll help you." Bruce turned back to Lillian, now clearly decided. "I'll give you one last chance to admit what you did. Otherwise, we'll resolve this the proper way, with the police." Lillian felt her heart tighten. "I have nothing to admit because I did nothing wrong. Please, Mr. Bruce, I beg you to listen to me." Vivian smiled discreetly, satisfied with the turn of events. "Father, she has no way to defend herself. It's clear it was her." Bruce pointed to the door of the maid's room. "Lillian, stay in your room until I decide what to do, and don't try to leave, or things will get even worse for you." Lillian nodded slowly, feeling the weight of injustice on her shoulders. Before leaving, she looked at Vivian. whose satisfied expression was a cruel reminder that the situation was even darker than it seemed. When Lillian entered her room, she sat on the bed and let the tears roll down her face. She thought of her son, how this situation could affect him, and how much she needed to fight to clear her name. "I can't give up. I need to find a way to prove my innocence," she murmured to herself, holding a picture of the boy. That night, while the rest of the house was silent, Vivian appeared outside Lillian's room. Her shadow, cast by the hallway light, seemed an omen of something sinister. "I hope you know this is just the beginning, Lillian. If you keep denying it, you'll bitterly regret it," Vivian said in a venomous tone before walking away. Lillian sat up in bed as soon as Vivian disappeared down the hallway. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and resistance. "Why does she insist on hating me so much? I've always done my best for this family," she muttered to herself, her hands trembling slightly. The distant sound of a clock marking the hours echoed in the room, amplifying the loneliness she felt. Outside, the wind blew fiercely, making the trees sway as if sharing Lillian's anguish. She got up, walked to the window and closed it, trying to muffle the sounds that increased her restlessness. "Tomorrow will be another day, another confrontation. But I need to fight for myself and my son," she thought with renewed determination. The mansion, with its wide hallways and adorned walls, seemed less like a home and more like a prison that night. Lillian knew that, despite all the luxury surrounding her, her position was precarious. The pain of the unjust accusation burned in her chest, but she decided she would cry no more. "My tears won't change anything. I need to think of a way to prove my innocence." Lillian lay down again, but sleep was slow in coming. She thought of her son, wondering if he was okay, if he missed her. "What will become of the two of us if I can't figure this out?" she questioned in her mind, feeling a pang of despair mixed with longing. Her eyes roamed the ceiling of the room, as if searching for answers in the shadows cast by the faint hallway light. Suddenly, a muffled sound caught her attention. Lillian got up quickly, her heart pounding. Upon cautiously opening the door, she realized there was nothing there. "I'm starting to imagine things, or maybe this house is driving me insane," she whispered to herself, closing and locking the door again. As the minutes dragged on, Lillian decided to retrieve the small diary she kept hidden under her mattress. Writing had always brought her comfort, a way to vent without fear of judgment. Today was another difficult day. "I feel like the world is against me, but I know I need to keep going. I can't give up," she wrote with steady hands, despite the emotional weight she carried. Vivian, on the other hand, felt victorious. In her luxurious room, she looked at the hidden necklace inside a locked drawer. "This will keep her under control for a while. The maid will learn her place," she said to herself, chuckling softly. Her mind was already planning the next step, determined to completely destroy Lillian. In the maid's room, Lillian finally closed her diary and put it away. The feeling that something was about to happen was almost palpable, but she refused to surrender to fear. "The truth always comes to light. I just need strength to endure until then," she thought, trying to comfort herself with her own words. The night remained dark and silent, except for the occasional creaking of the trees outside. Lillian closed her eyes and tried to remember happy moments with her son, moments that seemed to belong to another life. "I will protect him no matter what happens," she promised herself, as exhaustion finally began to overtake her. When the mansion's clock struck midnight, the atmosphere felt heavier. Vivian, in her room, turned in bed with a satisfied smile on her face. Lillian, in contrast, finally succumbed to sleep, but not before muttering one last silent prayer. "Please, let tomorrow bring some hope." Lillian remained silent, hugging her pillow as she tried to find some hope in the midst of that desperate situation. "I won't let them destroy my dignity. I need to be strong, for my son and for the truth," she thought as sleep finally enveloped her, bringing dreams of happier times. The next day, Lillian was summoned to Bruce's office, and the humiliation began early. Lillian was kneeling on the floor of Bruce's sumptuous office, tears in her eyes, but not letting her dignity slip away with them. The dark wood-paneled walls seemed to close in around her, as Bruce stared at her from across the desk, his thick eyebrows arched in an expression of severity. Beside him, Vivian exuded barely concealed satisfaction, her arms crossed and a mocking smile dancing on her lips. "Mr. Bruce, for God's sake, I didn't steal anything. I would never do that," Lillian pleaded, her trembling hands on her apron. "I've worked in this house for years, always with honesty and respect." Bruce raised a hand, cutting her off. "Lillian, my daughter's necklace is a one-of-a-kind and extremely valuable piece. If you are innocent, how do you explain it being found in your room?" He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "That's right, Father. She must have hidden it, hoping for an opportunity to sell it later," Vivian said, her voice dripping with malice. "I always knew she was fake. I never trusted her." Lillian opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. Her mind was racing for answers. How had the empty jewelry box ended up there? She knew it was a setup, but any word spoken seemed fragile in the face of the hostility surrounding her. "It's a trap," she thought, but kept her gaze steady. "Mr. Bruce, I swear on my life that I am innocent." The door suddenly opened, and Maya rushed in, her face flushed. The girl approached Lillian, grasping her hand firmly. "Father, please listen to Lillian. She would never do such a thing. She's like a mother to me." Bruce snorted and rose from his chair, imposing like a mountain. "Maya, you don't understand. This is not a matter for children. Lillian needs to explain how this happened. If she cannot, the consequences will be severe." Vivian seized the opportunity, her voice cutting like a blade. "Lillian, wouldn't it be better to confess now? We can be more understanding if you tell the truth now." "Of course she wants to see me humiliated," thought Lillian, squeezing Maya's hand, "but I won't give in." Bruce walked to the window, observing the garden under the pale light of an overcast day. He remained silent for a moment before turning back to Lillian. "You will remain confined to your room until I decide what to do, and don't try to leave. If something like this happens again, I won't hesitate to call the police." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her posture upright. "Yes, sir, I will do whatever it takes to prove my innocence." Vivian looked at her cruelly. "Prove it then," Vivian murmured, the smile widening into a cruel mockery. "But it won't do any good. We all know the truth." Maya turned to her father, indignant. "Dad, this is not fair. Lillian has always been faithful to our family. She doesn't deserve this." Bruce did not respond, merely gesturing for Lillian to leave. The decision was made. In the dark hallway, Lillian walked back to the maid's room. Her steps echoed across the wooden floor, accompanied only by the whispers of her conscience. "What more could they do to break me?" she thought as she closed the door behind her. Inside the room, she sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders heavy with the weight of injustice. Her eyes wandered around the small space, landing on the portrait of her son that she kept hidden in the drawer. "For him, I need to be strong. I can't let myself be discouraged now." While Lillian tried to organize her thoughts on the other side of the house, Vivian was celebrating. She was in her room, lounging on the bed, a smile on her face. "I want to see how long she lasts before she crumbles. The truth is, she shouldn't even be here," she said aloud to herself. Vivian got up from the bed and went to the mirror. She observed her own expression, full of satisfaction, and delicately adjusted her hair. "This house needs order, and I'm the only one who can ensure that. Lillian should understand that she's out of place," she thought, as she experimented with different shades of lipstick for her reflection. The silence around her only reinforced her sense of control. In the hallway, the echo of Bruce's footsteps passing by her room made her raise an eyebrow. For a moment, she considered going to talk to him, but she gave up. "He needs to see that the only solution is to get rid of her, and I know exactly how to convince him," she reflected, smiling to herself. Later that night, Bruce pondered in his study. The glass of cognac in his hands was almost empty as he stared into the fireplace. He didn't know if he could fully trust what had happened. Lillian had always been loyal, but the evidence was clear. If she really is guilty, I can't keep her here. But if she's not? The tension on his face was visible. Bruce rubbed his forehead with his free hand, trying to clear his thoughts. "It's not just about the necklace. It's about the balance of this house. Any mistake can bring it all crumbling down," he thought. He let out a long sigh, but the sound of crackling wood in the fireplace brought him back to reality. Next to him, the phone rang softly. He looked at the device but didn't answer. "Not now," he murmured, raising the glass for another sip. He needed to decide, but each possibility seemed worse than the other. Am I being fair or just blinded by pressure? Meanwhile, in the maid's room, Lillian couldn't sleep. She watched the shadows dance on the ceiling, every sound amplifying her anxiety. She knew that something more was to come. I need to find a way to prove my innocence. But how? She thought, feeling the tears well up. Lillian sat up in bed, clutching the handkerchief in her hands. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant sound of wind in the trees. They don't want to hear the truth. They just want someone to blame, she thought as her eyes scanned the small bedside table where her diary lay. For a moment she considered writing, but exhaustion prevented her. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe deeply. I can't lose faith now. My son needs me, and this house needs the truth, she thought as a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. The sound of a distant clock ticked away the seconds, each one heavier than the last. Just before midnight, light footsteps echoed down the hallway. Vivian was there. She approached Lillian's bedroom door, her malicious expression illuminated by the faint hallway light. She slowly opened the door, pushing it just enough for her slender figure to be visible. I hope you know this is only the beginning, Lillian, Vivian said with a venomous tone. If you keep denying, you'll bitterly regret it. Morning came with an uncomfortable silence, but the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Lillian got up early, her eyes marked by a sleepless night, trying to muster the courage to face what she knew was to come. Breakfast was served, but the housekeeper was not called to the table, an exclusion that already anticipated the day's hostilities. As she straightened the living room, Maya entered and approached with evident concern on her face. Lillian, I'm worried. They're talking about a meeting and the police will be here. What's going on? The young woman whispered, squeezing the maid's hand tightly. Lillian tried to keep her composure. Don't worry about me, dear. I just want the truth to prevail. Shortly after, Vivian descended the stairs in an impeccable dress and a triumphant expression. Her steps echoed on the marble as if they were a prelude to something grave. She looked at Lillian with disdain before declaring, Father wants you in his office now, don't be late. Oh, and pack your things. I don't think you'll need your room anymore. Lillian remained calm, though her heart was racing. I can't get rid of the truth so easily, Vivian, she replied, keeping her tone firm even when the young woman rolled her eyes. We'll see who's right, she thought, as she followed down the hallway. At the office, Bruce was standing, observing the window with his hands crossed behind his back. Next to him, a uniformed man waited patiently, checking notes on a clipboard. When Lillian entered, he turned slowly, his face inscrutable. Sit down, Lillian. We have very serious matters to deal with, said Bruce, gesturing to a chair in front of the desk. She obeyed, feeling the weight of the accusations hanging in the air. Whatever happened, I swear on my life that I'm innocent, said Lillian, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her nervousness. The policeman cleared his throat and began to speak in a neutral tone, as if he were merely fulfilling his duty. We received a report about the disappearance of a highly valuable necklace. The circumstances point directly to you. He looked at Lillian, expecting some reaction. She widened her eyes, shaking her head quickly. This is a mistake. I would never do such a thing, she exclaimed. But Vivian, who was entering the office with a triumphant smile, interrupted. She's always had access to the room where the necklace was kept. Of course it was her. Bruce raised his hand, asking for silence, but his expression showed that doubts were accumulating. Lillian, I want to believe you, but this situation is out of control. The evidence is strong and I need to make a decision, he declared, running his hand over his forehead. There is no evidence, only assumptions based on what she says, Lillian retorted, pointing to Vivian. But Bruce looked away. My duty is to protect this house, he thought, although the decision weighed heavily on his mind. Maya appeared at the door, her eyes wide as she realized the gravity of the situation. Father, this is not right. Lillian would never steal. She's like a second mother to me, said the young girl, approaching quickly. But Bruce shook his head firmly. Maya, don't make this more difficult than it already is. I need to think about the integrity of the family, he replied, although his daughter's expression made him hesitate for a moment. I won't allow injustice to happen before my eyes, thought Maya, feeling tears welling up. The policeman took a step forward, taking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Ma'am, I ask that you cooperate with us to avoid further complications, he said, as Lillian looked at the object in his hands in disbelief. No, I didn't steal anything. This is a setup, she shouted, but Vivian laughed softly, crossing her arms with satisfaction. Look, Lillian, Maybe the truth hurts more than you imagined, said Vivian, malice overflowing in her words. You're making a terrible mistake, thought Lillian, despair tightening her chest. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the metallic click of the handcuffs opening. Lillian instinctively backed away, but the policeman's hands were firm. Please, sir, look into my eyes. I would never do such a thing. I didn't steal anything, she pleaded, her voice heavy with anguish. But Bruce kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as if avoiding her gaze would alleviate the guilt that was gnawing at him. You know that's not true, Father, Lillian shouted in a last effort to appeal to his conscience. Enough, Vivian, Bruce ordered, although without the usual authority in his voice. He avoided looking at the maid as she was handcuffed. Maya tried to intervene, grabbing her father's arm. Please, Father, this is cruel. She deserves a chance to defend herself, she pleaded, but Bruce gently pushed her hand away. Maya, don't make this more painful. The situation is already out of my control, he replied, his voice heavy. I won't forget this injustice, thought Maya, staring at her father with indignation. Lillian was led out of the office, the cold handcuffs tightening around her wrists. Her heart seemed like it wanted to explode, as memories of years of dedication to that family ran through her mind. All I did was take care of this house and protect its secrets, she thought, as she felt the weight of the unjust judgment on her shoulders. Vivienne followed behind, watching the scene as if it were a spectacle. Goodbye, Lillian. I hope prison is as welcoming as you deserve, said Vivian with a cruel laugh. When they reached the hallway, a child's scream echoed through the mansion. Maya ran to Lillian, crying uncontrollably. He clung to her legs, refusing to let go. Don't go, he pleaded, sobs cutting the heart of everyone watching. Lillian tried to crouch down to hug him, but the handcuffs made the movement difficult. Everything will be cleared up. No matter what happens, she said, her voice trembling as tears finally escaped. Bruce approached slowly, his expression inscrutable. He placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to push her away. Don't make everything more difficult, Maya, said Bruce, his voice firm. Lillian looked at him in shock, despair finally overflowing. You can't do this. She needs me, she shouted, but Bruce looked away, unable to face her directly. This is my final decision, he said, as the policeman began to lead Lillian out of the mansion. I will prove my innocence. I promise, thought Lillian, as the door closed behind her, leaving only the sound of sobs echoing in the heavy air. The noise of the police car parked in front of the station seemed an ominous portent for Lillian. The officer pulled her out firmly but not brutally. The handcuffs tightened around her wrists, and the looks from the other officers seemed a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She knew there was nothing to say that could change what was happening, but her mind wouldn't stop. Is my son okay? Is Maya crying? She thought as she was led into the cell. Within the cell, the environment was hostile. Other women stared at her, some with disdain, others with a chilling indifference. She sat in a corner trying to control the trembling of her hands. I don't belong in this place, she muttered softly, but no one seemed to hear. Deep down, the shame of being there gnawed at her, more than the reality of the cramped and fetid space she found herself in. One of the inmates laughed upon hearing her words. Here, nobody belongs, but we're all trapped, darling. The hours passed slowly, as if time was mocking her anguish. The darkness of night arrived, bringing with it an unsettling silence. She hugged her knees, trying to protect herself from the cold and fear. Her thoughts turned to her son, and tears fell warm and relentless. I promised I would return to him. I can't fail, she thought, struggling to maintain her sanity. In the morning, the jailer appeared and unlocked the cell. You got lucky, you're free, he said, throwing her belongings on the floor with disdain. Lillian didn't respond. She was too exhausted to argue or thank him. As soon as she stepped onto the street, the cold wind of a new day seemed to mock her freedom. She took a deep breath, trying to recompose herself. Now begins the most difficult part, she muttered, pursing her lips. Lillian walked aimlessly through the city streets, holding what little she had in a plastic bag. Without money, friends, or a place to go, she knew she needed to find a solution, but her mind was in chaos. Each corner she turned brought a new weight to her heart. I can't give up. I have to find a way to get my son back, she thought, as her empty stomach protested with sharp pains. She knew where her son was. He was with his father, but that didn't console her. Her ex-husband was not an affectionate man, and the idea of her son growing up in a cold and distant environment filled her with dread. He doesn't know how to care for a child. He never even tried to understand what I did for our family, she thought, remembering the times when he ignored her or treated her condescendingly. Lillian's mind was trapped in the past, in the lonely nights when she tried to keep the house in order and care for her son. She remembered the promises made, the broken trust, and how over time everything had crumbled. Her ex-husband had always been indifferent, and she could no longer bear to see her son growing up without affection. The pain of being away from her son became unbearable, more so than the hunger consuming her. She felt guilt, frustration, and anger pulsing through her veins. Determined to ask for help, Lillian stopped in front of a small grocery store. The owner, a middle-aged woman with a stained apron, recognized her immediately. "You're the woman who appeared in the newspaper, aren't you? The mansion thief," she said with a cruel smile. Lillian tried to argue. "It's not true. I was falsely accused," she said, but the shopkeeper shook her head, laughing. "Falsely? Every thief says that. Get out of here before I call the police." Lillian felt a pang in her chest, as if each word from the shopkeeper was a knife cutting her dignity. She tried to remain steadfast, but the humiliation was too much. The look on the grocery owner's face was full of contempt, and the cruel smile that accompanied the words made her feel even smaller. "I can't believe what I'm hearing. Why does no one believe me?" she thought, feeling loneliness tighten her chest. Lillian backed away, humiliated and defeated. She continued walking, avoiding the stares of people around her, but the whispers were inevitable. "There goes the woman who robbed her employers," she heard someone say. Heat rose to her face and tears threatened to fall again. "I need to prove my innocence. But how? Not even my own family believes me," she thought, quickening her pace. It was as if everyone around her was waiting for a misstep, ready to judge her. Every whispered word, every disapproving look seemed to cut even deeper. She had been a good employee, had worked her hardest, and yet ended up on the streets with no one to defend her. But one thing was certain: she wouldn't give up. Not as long as there was a chance to reverse this situation and regain what she had lost. Lillian wandered aimlessly, growing weaker. She had lived at the mansion and all at once lost her home and job. She felt lost. Lillian tried asking an elderly woman passing by with grocery bags for help. "Please, I just need something to eat," she pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. The woman looked her up and down and gave a dry laugh. "Go work like everyone else." "I don't have time for vagrants," she replied before continuing on her way. Lillian stood still, too drained to argue further. It was hard to accept people's indifference, their lack of empathy. She knew the weight of her situation was written on her face, but what hurt the most was the feeling of being invisible. Every dismissive glance, every cruel comment seemed to diminish her dignity. She just wanted a chance, a friendly hand to help her back up. But in that moment she felt as if she was alone in the world, with no one willing to look at her with compassion. The sun was already high, and the heat made her head spin. She sat on a sidewalk trying to catch her breath. The flow of people ignored her completely, as if she were invisible. "I never thought my life could come to this." From a dedicated employee to a despised vagrant, she reflected, as the emptiness in her stomach seemed to consume her last energies. The world around her seemed a cold and distant place where she no longer had value. The city, with its tall buildings and bustling streets, seemed to have become a maze of indifference. Loneliness tightened her chest, and she felt the weight of her own misery. But there was something else on her mind, something that kept her alive, something that drove her to keep going. The desire to see her son again, to prove her innocence and be able to see Maya again. She had a great affection for the girl. Suddenly she felt her vision darkening. The voices around her began to fade, turning into an indistinct hum. Lillian tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey. "No, I can't pass out now," she thought, desperate. But her body couldn't take it. She fell onto the sidewalk, her face lightly hitting the ground. The impact was slight, but the feeling of loss and defeat was immense. She knew she was close to passing out, but the image of Maya, the memory of the son she loved, still shone in her mind. "I need to go back to him. I need to do this," she thought, before completely losing consciousness. As pedestrians passed by, Some looked at her with curiosity, but no one stopped to help. The indifference was as cruel as the hunger that consumed her. The sun shone mercilessly on Lillian's frail figure, unconscious and forgotten. "I promised to come back to him. My son," was her last thought before completely losing consciousness. Lillian woke with a chilling sensation, but what scared her most was the feeling of not knowing where she was. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing a simple wooden ceiling and a dim light coming through the window. She tried to move, but soon realized she was lying on a hard bed, covered only by a thin blanket. The pain from her body, marked by the fall on the sidewalk, still persisted, but the greater discomfort was the strange solitude she felt in that place. "You're awake?" a hoarse voice asked, and Lillian turned her head with difficulty. In front of her, a roughly dressed man watched her with distrustful eyes. He wore simple clothes like most there, but his gaze was far from welcoming. "You collapsed on the street. The community people brought you here." He seemed more interested in observing her than offering help. "Now what are you doing here? You don't seem like the type who frequents shelters." Lillian didn't know what to answer immediately. She tried to sit on the bed, but weakness prevented her from making any quick movement. "I have nowhere to go," she managed to say, her voice still weak but filled with determination. The man, who seemed to be one of the shelter residents, merely observed her with skepticism, as if he didn't believe her words. "Well, this is a shelter," he replied indifferently before turning to leave the room. "Just stay cool and don't cause any trouble." Lillian felt a growing weight in her chest, but she knew she couldn't let that bring her down. She wasn't there to give up. As she struggled to get up, another man entered the room. He looked at her with a slightly friendlier expression, but soon the suspicious hostility returned. "How are you doing?" he asked, looking at the dirty blanket. "Need any more help?" Lillian looked at him with a little more hope, but the man soon surprised her by speaking in a low voice, almost a whisper. "I can help you, but we need to talk calmly, okay? Here, nothing is for free." Lillian sat on the bed and watched the man carefully. There was something sincere about him, but she knew she had to be cautious. "What do you want in return?" she asked, suspicious, trying to hide the frailty in her voice. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Nothing too much, I just want to help you with whatever you need. But life here is tough, and you have to understand that nobody gives anything for nothing." Lillian nodded, still unsure of what to expect. The conversation was interrupted when the man left and returned with a package. "Here, take this," he said, handing her an old simple outfit that seemed a bit more comfortable than what she was wearing. She took the clothes, thanking him with a small smile, but before she could put them on, the man furtively approached her and, in a quick motion, snatched from her hands the only decent piece of clothing she had. "This is worth more than you think, woman," he said, before leaving through the door with the item in his hands without looking back. Lillian stood motionless for a few seconds, stunned. What had just happened left her speechless. She tried to understand what had just happened, but the pain of betrayal was as deep as any physical blow. "I can't trust anyone anymore," she thought, feeling a growing anger. She wasn't there to be deceived or used as a toy. And as much as her strength was diminishing, she knew she couldn't give in to that. The fight was only just beginning. She quickly put on the old clothes the man had given her, still feeling the weight of humiliation. Lillian got up from the bed, determined to leave that place. "I'm not like that. I'm not prey to be robbed or manipulated," she thought, as she looked out the window toward the street. She knew she had to return to the city and do whatever it took to find her son. She could no longer wait. With firm but cautious steps, Lillian left the shelter. The door creaked as it opened, and she quickly passed through a dirty hallway without looking back. The man who had tried to help her now treated her with indifference, and Lillian felt a growing need to leave that place behind, never to return. She felt the city around her, full of possibilities but also full of obstacles. And deep down she knew her real challenge was only just beginning. "I can't allow any more failures. Not when my son and Maya need me," she thought, feeling the pain of separation grow. The sight of her daughter's face still haunted her, as if it were the last true thing she still possessed. And Lillian knew time was against her. Lillian walked the streets aimlessly, her eyes fixed on the horizon where Bruce's mansion rose imposingly. She knew that there, in that cold and distant place, lay the key to her redemption. If I can convince Bruce to listen to me, maybe I can, she thought, her heart beating faster with every step. I need to prove my innocence. I need him to know the truth. As she approached the mansion, Lillian felt a knot in her stomach. The imposing iron gate with its security system seemed impenetrable, but she had no choice but to try. Bruce had been responsible for separating her and Maya, and now, more than ever, she knew that only he could help her reverse her situation. She approached the security guard at the entrance, but before she could speak, the man interrupted her with a firm voice. "You can't come in, ma'am," he said, crossing his arms. "This is a private location." Lillian felt the world crumble again. She tried in a soft voice, "Please, I just want to talk to Bruce. I need to see him. It's about what happened." But the security guard didn't budge. It was then that she saw him in the distance. Bruce appeared at the door with a grave expression, looking directly at her. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly. "I need to talk to you," said Lillian, her heart racing, fear and hope mixed in her chest. Bruce seemed impassive. He looked at the security guard and, with a gesture, authorized her entry. "Let her in. She's here for something important." He looked at Lillian and, with a stern expression, continued, "I know what you want. But until you prove your innocence, everything will remain the same. Your husband came here and looked for me. He thought you were at the house and he left your son here. He was drunk. I don't believe he'll come back. So, don't worry about that. I'll take care of your son while everything gets resolved. He's not to blame." Lillian was in shock. What was he saying? Bruce was taking care of her son. She felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. "Thank you," she managed to say, but a part of her still felt lost. Bruce seemed so indifferent, so in control, but he had assured that he would take care of him. "Leave now," Bruce said, with a firmness that left her speechless. "There is nothing more to discuss." Lillian, with a tight chest, stepped back, not knowing what else to do. She still hadn't proven her innocence, but for now she would have to trust. She looked one last time at Bruce and at the closed gate of the mansion. She knew the fight wasn't over yet. She walked away, determined to continue seeking her truth. Lillian was paralyzed in front of Bruce, her heart beating faster with each word he said. "I know what you want, but until you prove your innocence, everything will remain the same." The weight of those words crushed her, and fear began to set in her mind, preventing any clear reasoning. The feeling of helplessness was so strong that she could barely react when he talked about her son. Lillian had realized that nothing had changed. Her drunken ex-husband with no conditions to take care of the child. "He will take care of my son," she repeated, not believing what she had heard, as she walked away from the mansion. Bruce seemed distant, unperturbed, as if he were talking about something that didn't involve a child. Lillian felt grateful, but something in her chest tightened. The only certainty she had at that moment was that Bruce had no intention of helping her. He was doing everything he could to keep her away from him, away from her daughter, and now from her son. Or perhaps he wasn't completely certain that she was a criminal and was trying to do something so that he didn't feel completely cruel. Lillian had no way of knowing what the reality was. The silence that followed was cutting. Bruce looked at her with disdain, motionless, distant as she moved away from the mansion's door. She knew she couldn't stay there, but the pain was so intense that it seemed impossible to leave. Her mind was at war, the need to fight for the truth and the pain of seeing her family destroyed. But finally she accepted it and went on her way, her body heavy, almost as if she were being forced out. Bruce didn't seem interested in any further explanations. He didn't want to listen. "I'm still going to prove my innocence," she thought as she looked at the mansion gate. Bruce seemed to be moving away, no longer interested in continuing that conversation. She knew she couldn't give up, that everything was yet to come, but what Bruce did next made her doubt if she could take a step forward. "I don't want to see you here again," he said loudly so she could hear from a distance, his voice now harsher, the threat clear. "If you show up one more time, I'm calling the police, and it will be the last time." Lillian looked at him with watery eyes, stood still in the distance. The guards began to approach, their expressions relentless. She knew she was at a disadvantage, but something inside her compelled her to resist. "What are you doing?" she shouted, unable to control the anguish in her voice. "Come on, get off the property!" said the guard, as if it were a death sentence. Lillian swallowed hard, feeling the pain of his words like a sharp blade. She tried to move forward but was immediately pushed back by the guards. "Come on, ma'am, hurry up," one of the men said with frightening calm. "Here, no one listens to you." Lillian fought with all her might, but her arms were immobilized and she was pushed towards the door. Her mind was in a whirlwind, her vision blurred by tears. "I need to get a place to stay. I need to get my son back," she thought. "I'm a mother. I won't be away from my son." But as she was dragged out of the mansion, she felt an increasing sense of despair. Bruce watched her from a distance, and she couldn't tell if he really cared about his son or just wanted to punish her. When she was finally placed outside the mansion gate, the gate was slammed shut behind her. The feeling of failure was so intense that she stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. She was at her wit's end, but she knew she couldn't give up. The guard took an envelope and handed it to her, then withdrew. Lillian opened it and looked at the paper inside. "Am I going to be tried?" she thought, trying to organize her thoughts. Bruce had sued her, and now she would have a trial for what happened. It would be a chance for her to prove her innocence, but it could be a trap set by Vivian. "I have to be there. I can't miss this chance." Lillian started walking, her steps heavy, her mind racing. She knew there was no time to waste. If Bruce was really suing her, if he wanted her to be tried, it meant something was about to happen. But as she walked, her eyes fell on a familiar figure in the distance. She stopped, her heart beating faster. It was Maya. The young woman looked at her with a nervous expression, as if trying to decide whether or not to approach. But before Lillian could take a step towards her, Maya discreetly approached. "Hi. No one knows I'm here," she whispered, quickly glancing around to make sure no one was watching. In her hands she held an envelope, which she quickly handed to Lillian. "Maya, what is this?" Lillian asked, her words muffled by tension. The young woman looked at her with a grave expression. "It's all I could get," Maya said, her voice low, almost imperceptible. "It's the only chance you have." She looked around again, afraid someone might see her. "I know what happened. Vivian won't leave you alone." Lillian looked at the envelope in her hands, her trembling fingers touching it. What would that envelope be? What did Maya know? She didn't want to ask too much, fearing someone might be watching, but the need to know the contents of that envelope was greater. Do you know what he's doing?" Lillian asked, her voice full of anxiety. "What is he planning?" Maya hesitated for a moment, but soon answered with a seriousness that made Lillian's heart race. "I can't say much. I just know you need to go to court. There's something there that can help you, but if you don't show up, it's all over." Her eyes were full of concern. "She will destroy everything." Lillian held the envelope tightly, her fingers still trembling. "I won't lose. I won't let her do this to my family," she thought, with Maya's voice echoing in her mind. But as she walked away quickly, a feeling of emptiness came over her. Bruce had said she would lose everything, but something in Maya's envelope could be the key to reversing what was to come. She took a deep breath, determined to do whatever it took to find a way out. As she walked the streets, her mind was a real torment. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The weight of the envelope in her hands reminded her of what was at stake. She knew that with Bruce in control of everything, the situation was far from favorable for her. But there was something mysterious about that envelope, something that could change everything. The wind was blowing hard, and the trees around seemed to stir as if reflecting her restlessness. She couldn't stop now. Vivian wanted her to lose everything. She wanted her to sink, but she knew her fight was far from over. The court, the trial, the envelope, it was all interconnected in a way she still couldn't fully understand. But Maya had said something important. There's something there that can help you. And she needed to find out what it was. With her eyes fixed on the path ahead, Lillian quickened her steps, increasingly determined. But something inside her still felt vulnerable. The fear of losing her son, the pressure to find a way to prove her innocence, it all seemed to crush her. She had to be stronger. She had no choice. Lillian turned the corner, now with the courthouse in mind. What could happen there? Bruce was suing her, but was it under the influence of his daughter Vivian? What was he planning? She couldn't let him dominate her completely. She knew that if something went wrong, she would lose her only chance to save her life and that of her son. Lillian continued on her way. She needed to find a place to stay, a shelter for that night. She glanced quickly to the sides. The fear of being defenseless on the streets was consuming her. There was something important in the envelope, she was sure of that. But what would she do with that information? How could she use it? She needed to get to a quiet spot and open the envelope to discover what Maya had given her. Lillian entered a quieter street where there was less movement. She stopped for a moment, looking at the envelope that was clenched in her hands. What could be so important in that piece of paper? I can't mess this up, she thought, with a growing sense of dread and urgency. She clutched the envelope against her chest, as if that could bring some kind of security. She knew she wasn't alone in the struggle, but she also knew she would have to be cautious. Suddenly, Lillian heard footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. Could Bruce be following her? She turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Relief was immediate, but the fear of being discovered didn't go away. She needed to keep moving without stopping, without hesitating. She was starting to become paranoid about everything. She needed to relax and clear her head. In the distance, she saw a quiet square and felt a momentary relief to realize she could hide there for a while. But her mind was far from calm. She finally opened the envelope and read the letter Maya had given her. Lillian took a deep breath, trying to calm down as she looked at the envelope. The square was empty, with the trees swaying gently in the wind and the street lamps casting soft shadows on the ground. She felt a growing tension, but knew she couldn't hesitate. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and carefully removed the note. Maya's words were there, written in a firm hand, but with a tone of urgency that made Lillian's heart race. I trust you, Lillian. I'm doing my best to find out what Vivian is plotting against you. She wants to see you out of the house forever, and I'm trying to understand how she's doing that. Please meet me at the park tomorrow night. I can help you. Maya. Lillian pressed the note against her chest, feeling the adrenaline rise. Maya was really trying to help, but the message was clear. The situation was more serious than she thought. Bruce, divided between his daughter and her, seemed to be increasingly distant, and now Vivian. What was she doing to manipulate him? Lillian looked around again, still wary that she might be followed. She then decided she needed to go to the park the next day. She had no other choice. If Maya was willing to help her, she couldn't ignore it. The next day, as she headed to the park, she thought, I need to know what Vivian is planning, Lillian thought as she began to hurry toward the park. The note was folded in her hands, but Maya's words kept echoing in her mind. She wants to see me out of the house. How could she prevent that? She knew her position was fragile, but still, there was a part of her that believed she could turn the situation around. Bruce still believed in her, or at least she wanted to believe that. But she didn't know what to do to reverse the accusation of theft that Vivian was creating against her. The path to the park was long, and night was falling, bringing a darkness that seemed to increase her insecurities. Every shadow seemed to hide a new danger. The tension was almost unbearable, but she needed to stay calm. Lillian didn't know what she would find when she met Maya, but she knew she would need to hear everything Bruce's daughter had to say. I have to know what she knows about Vivian, she thought, her steps quickening toward the park. I can't wait any longer. Upon arriving, the park was deserted, except for a few shadows moving among the trees. Lillian looked around, searching for Maya. She sat on a bench and looked at her watch, waiting for the young woman. The silence seemed an unbearable weight, and she wondered if she was really doing the right thing by trusting Maya. But at the same time, she had no other choice. If things continued as they were, she would be unmasked, and Vivian would have won. The wait seemed endless, and with every step she heard, Lillian turned in the hope of seeing Maya. But for a good while, no one appeared. She was already starting to question whether she should leave, but then she heard light footsteps on the grass. She turned quickly and saw Maya approaching, with a serious expression and eyes that showed a certain anguish. You made it, said Lillian, relieved but at the same time nervous. I really needed to know what's going on. Maya looked around, making sure they weren't being watched, and then sat down next to Lillian. I'm trying, Mum. I know you're in danger, and I'm doing everything I can to find out what Vivian is up to. Her voice was low, almost inaudible, but the tone of concern was evident. I've discovered something. That might help us, but you have to understand Vivian is not who she seems to be. She has a grudge against you, and ever since my mom died, It's only gotten worse. A grudge against me? Lillian asked, confused. What does she have against me? I've always tried to be her friend. I did my best to help. Maya looked around. She doesn't see it that way, Maya replied, her face somber. She sees you as a threat. You replaced my mother in your life, and that destroys her. She wants to be the lady of the house, and she won't rest until she sees you out of here. Lillian felt a chill run up her spine. She had always known that the relationship with Vivian was tense, but she didn't know to what extent the young woman hated her. But what is she doing to accuse me? What could she have against me? Maya sighed and looked around again. I think she's plotting something with the help of some people. She knows how to manipulate, and she's using that to make Bruce believe her. She's saying you stole the necklace. I don't know how, but she has something that could make that seem true. Lillian felt lost. Bruce is believing her? Lillian's heart tightened. He can't believe her. I'm innocent. I would never do that. Bruce knows that. He must know. I know, Maya said firmly, but he's torn. He loves Vivian and she's been manipulating him. He wants to believe you, but the pressure is being too much. He's starting to doubt. Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, trying to absorb everything Maya was saying. If all this was true, she was really in a desperate situation. Vivian's anger, the dirty game to manipulate her. It was all becoming more than she could bear. She needed to act, and act fast. Before she could say anything else, she heard a noise coming from the shadows, the sound of hurried footsteps. Maya froze, and Lillian felt a growing tension. Someone was coming. Suddenly, a female voice cut through the night. Maya! The voice was firm, laden with anger. Where are you? Show yourself. I know you're here. Lillian looked at Maya and saw the fear in her eyes. It was Vivian. She was there. You need to leave, Maya, Lillian whispered, trying to stay calm. Go now, she can't see you here. Maya hesitated for a moment, but then with a look of pain, she quickly got up and started walking in the opposite direction. Lillian hid behind a tree, trying to stay out of Vivian's sight. Her heartbeats were out of control. Vivian entered the living room of the mansion with hurried steps and a face red with anger. Bruce was sitting in the armchair, seemingly oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that was taking over his daughter. He looked at her, raising an eyebrow. What is it now, Vivian? His voice was tired, as if he had been trying to process the events for days. Maya is in cahoots with Lillian, Vivian said firmly, her voice laden with venom. I heard everything. They are lying against me, trying to destroy me. You have to do something, Dad. I can't take this anymore. She put her hands on her hips and looked defiantly at her father. Bruce sighed and leaned back in the armchair, his face exhausted. I still don't know who is right or wrong in this, Vivian. Things are very confusing. Maya has always been an honest person, and Lillian. Well, you know what happened to her, but I can't simply condemn her without having all the evidence. Bruce was clearly divided. Vivian's words weighed on him, but he still wanted to believe that Maya was on the right side. We can't wait any longer, Dad, Vivian insisted, her tone more threatening now. Maya is going to turn against us. She is already allying herself with that woman, and you don't see it. This is going to ruin our family. You need to take action. She took a step forward, trying to impose her presence. I know what's best for all of us, and Maya is a threat. Bruce looked at Vivian for a long moment, doubt visible in his eyes. He knew he had to act cautiously, but his daughter was going mad with anger, and he feared her anger might cloud her judgment. I will talk to Maya tomorrow, he said, trying to stay calm. She will tell me what's going on, and if Lillian is innocent, then everything will be resolved in court. Until then, we can't do anything else. Bruce spoke these words with a weight of despair, as if he were trying to convince himself more than Vivian. Vivian shot a cutting look at her father. If you think she's going to prove Lillian is innocent, you are completely mistaken. She's a liar. She's going to ally with whoever is necessary to destroy our family. The rancor in her words was palpable, and Bruce knew he couldn't ignore the ferocity with which Vivian spoke. Enough, Vivian. Bruce stood up suddenly, his patience running out. We won't make a scandal about this anymore. The court will resolve things. Now go rest. I need time to think about all this. He sat down again, exhausted, his head heavy with the internal conflicts he was facing. Vivian, furious and with no idea how to turn the situation in her favor, left the room, slamming the door hard. The sound of the door closing seemed to resonate throughout the corridor, a reflection of the emotional chaos she was experiencing. But Bruce didn't care about the noise anymore. He was immersed in his own thoughts, pondering whether he was really making the right decisions. Meanwhile, Maya was walking down a quiet street towards the house she had always known as her own. The conversation with Lillian still echoed in her mind. She knew the situation was becoming increasingly unsustainable. Vivian's pressure was growing, and she feared what could happen if she couldn't prove the truth. But something in Bruce's attitude was starting to bother her. He seemed more willing to listen to Vivian's words than hers. She needed to act fast, before the situation became irreversible. Upon entering the living room, Maya found Bruce sitting alone, looking pensive into the void. She approached him cautiously, and he looked at her with an expression of weariness. "Dad, I still believe in Lillian. I know she's not guilty. I'll do my best to prove it," Maya said, the sincerity in her words clearly visible. Bruce looked at her with a hardened demeanor, trying to remain impassive towards his daughter. "I understand your loyalty, Maya, but you're risking too much. Things are too complicated. I can't guarantee she's innocent without proof." He paused and looked intently at his daughter. "You understand what that could mean, don't you?" Maya swallowed hard but didn't waver. "I know what I'm doing is dangerous, but I trust her, and I'm sure I'm going to be able to prove her innocence. I won't give up on her." Bruce's expression was a mixture of skepticism and regret, but he knew Maya was determined. The atmosphere in the room became tense, and Maya felt there was something more Bruce wanted to say but couldn't. She was hoping for more words of support, but he just fell silent. Then, suddenly, he broke the silence. "If you believe in her so much, then prove it. I have nothing more to say about it. If she's innocent, it will be in court that everything will be resolved. Until then, it's better for you to focus on other things." Maya swallowed the words that were about to come out, knowing that this conversation would lead nowhere. She turned to leave, but before taking the first step, Bruce called her. "Be careful with your feelings, Maya. They can blind you. I cannot blindly support a cause without proof." He leaned back in his chair, ending the conversation. Maya stood there for a moment, motionless, looking at her father with a mixture of pain and frustration. There was no more room for argument. She knew he was stuck in his doubts, but deep down she felt that the truth was within her reach, even if it was difficult to prove. The confidence she had in Lillian was stronger than any accusation. But Bruce's eyes seemed distant, as if he was not willing to see the truth that she saw clearly. He didn't understand, or perhaps he didn't want to understand. With a heavy sigh, Maya took a step towards the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silent room. She felt the weight of each movement, as if she were being watched by something bigger than Bruce's own decision. The tension in the air was palpable, and Maya knew it was not an easy moment for anyone. But the decision she would make from here on had to be hers. She could no longer continue to live in fear of losing Lillian forever, not after all they had been through together. The door closed softly behind Maya, who left the room and went to her bedroom. The fresh night breeze made her thoughts quicken even more. She walked with her head down, trying to process Bruce's words, but a sense of relief also invaded her. Now the path was open for her to act, to finally fight for what she believed in. But something in her heart still weighed heavy. The doubt that Bruce had cast over her certainties was there, hovering in the air, like a shadow that didn't easily go away. Bruce was still sitting, lost in thought, as Vivian's words echoed in his mind again. He knew the court would have to decide everything, but he was also beginning to question his own feelings towards his daughter and Lillian. Something wasn't right there, and he needed to find out what it was. Until nothing was resolved, he would continue to keep Lillian's son safe there. Regardless of what she had done or not, her son was not to blame for anything. And after the trial, he would seek the proper guidance for him. Lillian wandered the streets, her stomach growling with hunger, but her determination drove her forward. She needed a job, something that could support her and take her son out of the precarious situation they were in. But in every place she tried, the answer was always the same. The accusation against her weighed more than any qualification she might have. At a small bakery, the owner didn't even look at her resume. "Sorry, but we can't accept people with that kind of history," he said, his expression closed. Lillian swallowed hard and quickly withdrew, trying not to show the pain on her face. "I need a chance," she thought, but the door closed behind her, and the biting end-of-day wind seemed to reflect the coldness of the world around her. She went to a modest restaurant, where the smell of hot food made her hesitate for a moment. She thought about asking for a job opportunity there, but as soon as she entered and asked to speak with the person in charge, the answer was immediate. "We don't have any vacancies, and we don't want any trouble here. You know what happens to people like you, right?" The man, a manager with an arrogant expression, didn't even try to disguise his contempt. Lillian tried to argue, saying she was willing to do any job, but he didn't listen to her. "Not here. Get out before I call the police." With trembling hands and teary eyes, she left without words, being watched by the other people in the restaurant, who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The weight of rejection was almost unbearable, and she felt even more alone in the world. The day dragged on, and Lillian, tired and hopeless, found herself again in front of the mansion. She knew she shouldn't be there, but the longing for her son consumed her. Even knowing the risk, she needed to see him, to know that he was okay, that he wasn't suffering from all of this. She went to the mansion again. She looked around, making sure no one saw her, and hid in the shadows of the trees around the garden. The mansion's lights were on, and she could hear the distant sound of her son's laughter as he played in the garden. Lillian's heart tightened, but she knew she couldn't get any closer. She couldn't take the risk. She sat carefully behind a tree, watching the scene from afar, trying to capture every movement, every laugh, every gesture of her son. He was so handsome, so healthy, so free from everything that consumed her. Lillian took deep breaths, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I'll make it, my love. I'll make it," she murmured to herself. But seeing the smile on her son's face, the weight of guilt became more present. She couldn't let him grow up like this, away from everything she knew to be good and right. Then she heard footsteps. Someone was approaching the garden, and she quickly hid, worried about the possibility of being seen. The tension in the air was palpable, and she knew she couldn't do anything to interfere at that moment. She tried to concentrate, trying not to make a sound while watching the mansion, but her thoughts were entirely focused on her son. It was then that Lillian noticed something peculiar. Vivienne, Maya's sister, was at the edge of the garden lake. She looked around suspiciously, as if she was sure she wasn't being watched, and then took something out of her bag. Lillian frowned, trying to see what it was, but the distance and darkness made it difficult for her to see. The object appeared metallic, and in a quick and precise motion, Vivienne threw it forcefully into the lake. The water of the lake rippled from the impact of the object, but Lillian couldn't see exactly what it was. Suspicion immediately took hold of her. "What is she doing?" she thought, her heart racing with doubt. She was about to stand up and move closer to investigate, but she heard a familiar voice calling from afar. "Maya!" Vivienne shouted angrily. Lillian shrank further behind the tree, her heart pounding, trying to remain hidden. She knew she couldn't be seen, but the desire to know what was going on propelled her. The silence was broken again, but now she could hear Vivienne's footsteps moving away from the lake. What could that object have been? Why throw it in there? The questions arose in her mind, but she knew she couldn't take any risks. Vivienne's anger towards her sister was something Lillian had always been aware of, but this was different. Something was being hidden, and she needed to understand what it was. When Vivienne's voice faded, she remained motionless for a few more seconds, trying to process everything she had seen. The sound of Vivienne's footsteps faded away, but Lillian still felt the tension in the air, as if something was about to be revealed. She blinked, trying to clear her thoughts. What could that object have been? Something so small, yet it seemed to hold great importance. The lake, now quiet, reflected the light of the few visible stars. She needed to find out what was going on, but a feeling of fear began to invade her mind. "What if I'm meddling where I don't belong, Gaisia?" she thought, hesitating for a moment. But curiosity was stronger. Lillian knew that if she didn't act now, she might miss the chance to understand what was happening. Vivienne was a calculating woman, always had something sinister in her demeanor, but now there seemed to be something more serious involved. Lillian took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand up slowly. The sound of her clothes rustling against the grass made her heart race. She walked carefully, staying in the darkness, away from the light of the mansion windows. The fear of being seen paralyzed her at times, but she couldn't turn back now. She didn't know what lay behind that wall of silence and secrets, but something told her it could change everything. Her eyes fixed on the illuminated garden in the distance. She saw the shadow of a figure moving, but she didn't know if it was Vivian or someone else. The mansion lights reflected off the leaves of the trees, creating strange shadows that made her feel even more watched. What would she do if she were caught? It could ruin everything. She knew she had to be cautious, but the need to understand what was happening propelled her to continue. With her body tense and her mind racing, she began to move away from the lake. But she didn't take her eyes off the spot where the object had fallen. Her mind recalled the moments when she had heard Vivian speak of her sister with resentment, but nothing that had been said made sense now. The object thrown into the water could be a small detail, but for Lillian at that moment, it seemed to be the key to something bigger. "What are you hiding, Vivian?" she thought, her eyes fixed on the point where the water was still moving. The darkness around seemed to grow, swallowing any trace of light, and every step Lillian took towards the exit path seemed more fraught with risk. Her mind was divided between the need to uncover the truth and the fear of what could happen if she was caught. The feeling of being on forbidden ground made her body tremble slightly, but she couldn't stop. Bruce's words still echoed in her head, but she couldn't let doubt paralyze her. She knew she needed to act, needed to understand the reason for all that tension in the air. With a tight stomach and a mind full of doubts, she walked away, keeping to the darkness. Each step seemed heavy, as if she were moving away from a possible revelation. But at the same time, the desire to know what was happening at the heart of the mansion propelled her. She knew she couldn't wait much longer, and every second that passed, the distance between her and the truth increased. But at the same time, the feeling of being watched was growing. Something wasn't right. She was aware that she might be making a mistake, but she couldn't ignore her intuition. "I need to find out what this is," she thought, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The darkness seemed to swallow Lillian as she walked away, her cautious but hasty steps echoing in her mind. Something was shining on the surface of the lake, reflecting the few visible stars. Lillian's curiosity pulled her closer to the water. She slowly crouched down, her fingers almost touching the surface of the lake, where the light reflected on a strange object that seemed to have been thrown in there. The glow was hypnotic, as if the object had been placed there on purpose, awaiting to be discovered. But before she could touch the water, she heard a familiar sound, the weight of a step and the rustle of clothes against the grass. Vivian was coming back. The pressure in Lillian's chest increased, and she immediately retreated, her heart racing. "I can't get caught now," she thought, desperate not to be seen. She retreated as fast as she could, her eyes fixed on Vivian's approaching silhouette. The object at the bottom of the lake grew more and more distant, but the feeling that something important was there didn't leave her mind. Vivian seemed to ignore everything around her, heading towards the mansion without noticing that Lillian was right behind her. Adrenaline coursed through Lillian's veins as she hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to disappear into the darkness of the night. "I'm still going to find out what this is," she thought with determination, knowing she couldn't abandon her search for the truth. When Vivian's silhouette disappeared inside the mansion, Lillian breathed a sigh of relief, but her body was exhausted. She knew she should get out of there before it was too late. Every step she took towards the exit seemed like a challenge. Her mind, still racing from what she had just witnessed, tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. What did that object mean? And why had Vivian thrown it into the lake? The answers kept slipping away, but the certainty that there was something much darker behind it all didn't leave her. As the days went by, Lillian's life became even more difficult. She faced the streets with no safe place, no decent food, and her health was deteriorating. The days of rejection and humiliation dragged on as she desperately tried to seek help. She tried to find old acquaintances, those who in another time had been her friends or allies, but they all ignored her or treated her with contempt. She couldn't understand what had happened. How could it be that after everything she had been through, no one cared about her? The feelings of abandonment made her feel even more alone. With her strength fading and hunger consuming her body, Lillian found herself at a crossroads. Her thoughts began to get confused. The world seemed to have closed in on her. and the truth she so desperately sought seemed more and more distant. Will I ever understand what's going on? She thought as she leaned against a wall, trying to protect herself from the cold wind. But at that moment a familiar presence approached. She looked up and saw Bruce's youngest daughter, whom she immediately recognized. The girl, with a shy look and a caring expression, approached and, without saying a word, handed Lillian a bag of food and a blanket. Lillian, her voice failing from so much gratitude, couldn't hide her surprise. "You don't have to do this," Lillian said, her voice low and trembling as she took the items. The girl smiled slightly and shook her head. "I know what you're going through. I can't leave you like this." Lillian looked at her, her gaze full of emotions she didn't know how to express. The kindness in the girl's eyes was like a relief amidst the chaos. It wasn't a solution, but it was help she didn't expect. Lillian sat down on the ground, the bag beside her, and began to eat voraciously, silently thanking her. The girl watched her with an attentive look, as if she knew that Lillian needed more than just food and a blanket. She needed a little humanity, a spark of kindness in such a cruel world. "Thank you," Lillian said, her voice stronger now when she finally looked at the girl. "I don't know how to thank you." The girl just smiled, slowly backing away, but before turning her back, she said, "Remember, you're not alone. I'll be around." Lillian watched her walk away, feeling an unexpected warmth in her heart. The girl's kindness was the solace she so desperately needed. She knew the struggle was far from over, but for the first time she felt that perhaps there might be some hope. Lillian knew something was wrong, but she didn't know exactly what was pulling her back to the mansion. Maybe it was the need to understand what was truly happening, or maybe it was a desperate attempt to find some sort of resolution for everything. She approached the entrance with hesitant steps, looking at the large wooden doors that had once been a symbol of comfort, but now seemed like a prison. The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the empty road. She took a deep breath and prepared herself for what could come. As she approached, she saw a familiar figure outside the mansion. Vivian was there, watching her with a piercing gaze. Lillian hesitated, but before she could turn away, Vivian saw her and quickly approached. "What are you doing here?" Vivian asked, her voice as sharp as a blade. Her expression was full of anger and distrust. Lillian braced herself for the confrontation, though her heart pounded hard within her chest. "I just want to understand. What's happening, Vivian?" Lillian said, trying to remain calm. "I never meant to harm you or your family. I was just worried about you and the house." She wasn't quite sure what to expect from the response, but she hoped the sincerity of her words would be enough to break the barrier of hostility between them. But Vivian didn't seem convinced. "You think I didn't notice?" she yelled, anger overflowing in her voice. "You tried to take my mother's place. You wanted the house for yourself. You were manipulating everything." Vivian's words were like stabs, each one more painful than the last. Lillian felt a lump in her throat but forced herself to continue. She couldn't let those accusations shake her. "That's not it, Vivian. I never wanted to take your mother's place. I was just trying to help. I just wanted you to be okay." Lillian tried to approach, but Vivian interrupted her with an aggressive gesture. "You don't understand. You think you can do whatever you want, that you can come into our lives and change everything. But I see you, I see what's behind your intentions." Vivian's anger seemed to be boiling over, and Lillian knew that nothing more would convince her to think otherwise. Lillian took a step back, feeling a sense of helplessness take over her body. But at the same time, she felt that Vivian's words were starting to lose their weight. Anger was a blind emotion, and Lillian knew that, as difficult as it was, she needed to remain calm. "I just wanted to help, Vivian," she repeated, her voice softer now but still full of determination. "I never meant to harm anyone. I cared about you and the house." Vivian looked at her with eyes full of confusion, as if she didn't know what to think. The anger was still burning in her chest, but there was something else there, something Lillian couldn't identify. "You're so pathetic," Vivian muttered, her voice low and full of contempt. "You think it will all be resolved like this? That you can just apologize and everything will be okay?" She took a step back, as if she were moving away from something that made her feel revulsion. "I don't want to hear from you anymore." Lillian watched Vivian walk away, her gaze hard and determined. She felt small, helpless in the face of that blind rage. But at the same time, she couldn't give up. Not there, not now. She needed to understand more, needed to know the truth, and wouldn't let anyone make her give up on that. But before she could take a step forward, a familiar voice echoed from the shadows. "I saw everything from afar," said Bruce, emerging from a corner of the mansion, his attentive and piercing gaze fixed on Lillian. She didn't know what to expect from him, but she knew she couldn't run away now. He was there and she would have to deal with him somehow. "Soon, everything will be resolved in court. Don't worry." Bruce's words felt like a blow, a confirmation that the situation was about to spiral out of control in an even more dangerous way. Lillian felt the blood freeze in her veins. She looked at him, her eyes wide, but she couldn't say a word. Bruce's mere presence there at the back of the garden made her body recoil in an almost instinctive way. He'd been watching everything, every gesture, every word, and now she knew he was more involved than ever. How could he be so calm? As if nothing that happened there was really important to him. "You saw everything?" Lillian finally managed to ask, her voice trembling, but with a tone of defiance. Bruce merely nodded slowly, as if what she was saying was irrelevant, but with a look that indicated a silent doubt. He wasn't as certain as he seemed, and she could feel that something wasn't resolved in his mind. He seemed in conflict, divided between what he had seen and what he still couldn't fully understand. The tension between them was palpable, and Lillian felt her stomach churn. She didn't know what to expect from him, but she knew something was wrong. Bruce didn't seem fully convinced of her guilt. He watched her with a mixture of distrust and hesitation, as if he hadn't yet made a definitive decision about what she represented to him. The feeling of powerlessness invaded Lillian's chest like a wave of cold. She tried to find words, some way to react, but she was so overwhelmed by emotions that nothing seemed to come. Bruce watched her, but not with the confidence of someone who already knows what to do. He seemed more undecided, waiting for more answers, more clarification. "You'll regret all this," she finally said, her words more a sigh than a real threat. Bruce merely shrugged, as if her words carried no weight at all. However, the glint in his eyes betrayed what he didn't want to admit. He wasn't as sure as he seemed. "It's done, Lillian," he calmly replied, but his voice faltered for a brief moment, as if he was forcing himself to believe what he was saying. "Soon everything will be settled in court." Each of his words seemed to crush her resistance even more, but at the same time she noticed the lack of conviction in his voice. Bruce wasn't entirely sure of what he was saying, and that somehow made her feel there was still a chance. Bruce slowly entered the mansion, his gaze fixed in Lillian's direction, unconcerned with what was happening around him. She could feel his presence with every step he took toward the door, as if he were there, watching, waiting for any slip-up. But the doubt still lingered in his eyes, and that made Lillian question everything she thought she knew about him. Lillian, in turn, had no more strength to fight at that moment. The tension, the fear, the anger, it all mingled into a whirlwind inside her. She didn't know whether to confront him or if it would be better to just disappear. But what else could she do? Bruce had the situation completely under control, but she knew he wasn't sure about everything, and that gave her some hope. He was always one step ahead, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't know what to do with it all. She turned her back, her body heavy, and began to walk out of the mansion, not looking back. Each step seemed a greater burden than the last, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. The ground seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and the sound of her own footsteps made her feel increasingly empty. Bruce's words continued to resonate in her mind, relentless, crushing. She felt the weight of Bruce's words crushing her. Every phrase, every sentence seemed to pierce her chest like a sharp blade. Everything will be settled in court. His promise, or would it be a threat? He seemed so sure that everything would be resolved the way he wanted. But Lillian didn't know if she could endure the weight. Everything seemed lost, but a part of her didn't believe Bruce had really made his final decision. The doubt still existed, and that gave her a thread of hope. She was defeated, feeling empty and aimless. But she knew that the end of that battle was still far away. The trial, the confrontation with Vivian, everything seemed like a great trap where she was trapped. There was no escape, and nothing seemed to be able to change what was about to happen. She had no more strength to continue fighting for herself, but she knew that somehow there was still something that needed to be done. What she didn't know was exactly what or how. Bruce in turn observed her from afar, with imperturbable eyes. He knew she was weak, but he also knew she wasn't entirely defeated. Perhaps that was what fascinated him, the way people reacted to being pushed to their limits. When Lillian walked away from the mansion, he entered with firm steps, without looking back, and the tension of the situation hung in the air. He was confident that soon everything would come to an end. Lillian walked with heavy steps, always in the area around the mansion and on the nearby streets, which were the places she knew, her thoughts a whirlwind. Bruce's words still echoed in her mind, reverberating like a distant and relentless echo. Everything will be resolved in court. But she felt deep down that there was more to that situation than he wanted to admit. He was in doubt, and that made her hesitate even in the face of his apparent victory. As she walked through the entrance of the mansion, a figure approached. A familiar sound interrupted her thoughts, the sound of quick but cautious steps. She stopped, disconcerted, and turned around. In front of her was Maya, the young woman who until then seemed to be just a shadow in the background. Now, with a determined look, she faced Lillian. "I know you didn't steal anything," Maya said with an intensity that made Lillian stop in her tracks. The words came with a weight Lillian wasn't prepared to carry. Surprised, she frowned. How could Maya know that? What did she mean by that? What was happening? The tension grew even more when the girl took a step forward, seeming to take courage. "I've already seen and heard enough in there to be sure of that," Maya continued, with a grave whisper that cut through the night like a blade. Lillian remained silent, watching the young woman, trying to understand what was going on. How did she know that? What had she heard? Maya's words formed a confusion of feelings in Lillian, relief mixed with fear. What should she do with this information? The situation seemed even more complicated now. "She just wants to blame you to get revenge on you for what she thinks you did, for taking your mother's place," Maya completed, her eyes fixed, unwavering from Lillian. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. A feeling of disbelief enveloped her. Revenge? She had no idea how to deal with that. It was more than she could immediately understand. But for a moment, Maya's words rang true as a possibility. An explanation that, as painful as it was, gave some sense to that whirlwind of accusations. "I heard everything in the big room when they thought I wasn't there," Maya completed, her voice firmer now. What had she heard? Lillian didn't know what to do with that revelation, but she knew it was something serious, something that could change everything. The wind passed between them, bringing a sense of discomfort and urgency. Lillian looked at Maya, her mind ablaze, trying to process every word, every piece of the truth she was hearing. What to do with that? She felt a chill run down her spine, but also a small flame of hope. The possibility that perhaps there was someone there willing to help her. But the risk was enormous. Maya was putting herself in danger by speaking so openly. She was risking a lot by taking that step. But how do you know that? "What else did you hear?" Lillian asked, her voice tense and trembling, still unsure who to really trust. Maya looked around, as if checking if anyone was watching her. Then, with a serious expression, she looked directly at Lillian. "I know more than you can imagine," she said, with the confidence of someone who had already made a decision. "I'm going to get proof that could save you, Lillian, something that will change everything, something they don't expect." The girl spoke with a conviction that made Lillian's heart beat faster. She didn't know if she should believe her, if she was deluding herself, but something in Maya's attitude seemed genuine, something she didn't feel in anyone in there. "Proof?" Lillian repeated, unsure if she really wanted to hear more. But the feeling that there was a chance to escape that prison of lies and intrigues was stronger than the fear that was beginning to grow inside her. "What are you going to do?" she asked more quietly now, the weight of Maya's words still hanging in the air between them. "I will get what you need," Maya replied, with a smile that, though small, carried a promise. "But you have to trust me. This won't be easy, and you have to be ready for what comes after." The young woman seemed to know what she was saying, as if she had already weighed the risks and consequences of her actions. Lillian knew she was dealing with something much bigger than she could understand, but at the same time, a part of her wanted to believe, wanted to trust. She had little left to lose now. The tension was palpable. Lillian, feeling the weight of those words, knew she couldn't back down. Something had to be done, and Maya might be the only chance. "Are you sure you can get this? that this will really help me. Lillian didn't know what else to ask, but she needed to understand if what she was hearing was real. The danger of false hope consumed her. Yes, Maya replied, with a confidence that only the young can have, a certainty that somehow everything would work out. I know where to look, and I will get what you need to prove that you did nothing wrong. You just can't let it knock you down before you see the truth. Her eyes were fixed on Lillian, as if she wanted to convey all her strength to her. I know you can get through this. Lillian felt a lump in her throat. It was as if somehow a small light had lit up in her chest, a thread of hope, even though she didn't know exactly how it would unfold. The only thing she knew for sure was that, from that moment on, her life would be decided by this one chance. But the risk was great, and she didn't know if she was ready to face it. I trust you, Lillian said, more to herself than to Maya. But what happens after? The doubt still hung in the air, but the young woman's words had planted a seed that could not be ignored. She had nothing more to lose. Maya tilted her head, as if the answer was clear. After, Lillian, after you'll have to face everything that comes, but for now trust that I can help you. I won't leave you alone. Her expression was serious, and the decision was made. The help was in motion, and nothing more could be done until the truth came out. Lillian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word that had been said. She knew she was entering into something much bigger than she could control, but she also knew that the fight was far from over. "And what else do you need from me?" she asked, with a tone of determination she herself didn't know she had. Maya looked at her one last time before taking a step back. "Nothing more for now," she replied, "but stay alert. Things are going to get much more complicated. The trial will be the final battlefield." She turned then, and Lillian felt for the first time that something had changed. Perhaps there was still a chance. And with those words, the young woman disappeared into the darkness of the night, leaving Lillian alone, but with a feeling that the fight was not yet lost. The day of the trial had finally arrived. The muffled sound of footsteps echoed through the empty courthouse corridor. Lillian was sitting on the defendant's bench, the weight of everyone's gaze upon her, crushing her soul. Her hands were trembling, but she tried to control her anxiety, focusing on every detail around her. The courtroom was full, the wealthy families and lawyers positioning themselves confidently, as if they already knew what the outcome of that hearing would be. She, on the other hand, was alone, without proper legal representation, facing not only the accusation, but also the contempt of everyone who watched her as if she were a criminal. Lillian felt the gaze of each person like a blade in her chest. Every second was a torment, and she knew the only thing she could do now was fight. "The court is ready to begin," announced the judge, his deep, impersonal voice cutting through the silence. Lillian looked at the wealthy family's lawyers, who were already ready to present their first evidence. They were confident, as if they were about to bring the woman down with a single blow. She didn't know if she was prepared to face the avalanche of accusations that would follow, but she knew she had no other choice but to try. The wealthy family's lead attorney stood up, addressing the judge with an arrogant posture, and began to speak. "Your Honor, the defendant, Lillian, is being prosecuted for a crime that not only harmed the integrity of the family, but also violated the trust that was placed in her. It was not only a betrayal, but a calculated act that put her in a position of theft, and now, with this evidence, we have full certainty of her guilt." He extended a set of documents and a recording to the judge, while all eyes in the courtroom turned to Lillian, awaiting a reaction from her. The judge examined the documents, and the tension in the room increased. "What is this?" he asked, flipping through the papers. The attorney smiled with satisfaction. "Here we have proof that the defendant was on several occasions in possession of valuable items belonging to the family. Items that, according to investigations, were not properly authorized or explained. The accusation seemed unbeatable. The audience murmured, and Lillian felt her stomach tighten. The attorney's words reverberated in her mind like a merciless echo. What could she do? How could she prove her innocence now? The accusation continued, with more evidence being presented, and Lillian was paralyzed. The words sounded like an unbearable weight. There was no escape, no witnesses to defend her, and the judge seemed increasingly convinced of her guilt. She felt humiliation tightening every pore of her being. Sweat trickled down her forehead as she tried to think of a defense, something that could save her life. But what could she do if everything seemed to be against her? "I was never a threat to this family," Lillian shouted, rising abruptly. The room fell silent. The stares turned to her with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "I'm not guilty." She was desperate, the words coming out of her mouth unfiltered. Her voice trembled, but she continued. She felt her heart pounding, fear and anger mingling in an emotional whirlwind. It was the only thing she could do now, fight with what little dignity remained. The silence in the room was crushing. Every gaze seemed to pierce Lillian like a sharp blade. She knew she had nothing more to lose, but the tension was unbearable. The words of the wealthy family's lawyer still echoed in her mind. The accusations against her seemed so clear, so organized. She felt as if she was being crushed by an invisible pressure, a force greater than she could control. There was no way out now. Either she fought with everything she had, or she would be swallowed by the torrent of lies that had been woven against her. She looked at the judge, hoping for some sign of compassion, but he watched her with an impersonal gaze. His face was expressionless, like a stone mask. There was no empathy there, no understanding. Only the cold and distant authority of a man accustomed to judging lives as if they were numbers on a spreadsheet. Lillian felt a wave of revolt. How could all of this be so unfair? Why was she being treated like a criminal when all she had done was try to survive? "I'm telling the truth," Lillian cried, her voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't do anything wrong. They're trying to destroy me for something I didn't do." She felt the eyes of those present fixed on her, as if she was being scrutinized. Every word she said being measured and judged. The room was tense, almost palpable, and the weight of humiliation seemed to have grown with her last statement. She knew she couldn't convince everyone, but she had to fight. She had to show that she still had some strength. The judge, apparently disturbed, called for silence. "Miss Lillian, please control yourself," he said impassively, showing no compassion. She felt her stomach churn with the coldness of the words. Each syllable seemed like a blow, heavier than the one before. She wanted to respond, wanted to shout that it wasn't fair, but something inside her remained silent. It wasn't the time for more confrontations, not with all those eyes on her, not with the audience so tense. But she couldn't give up now. Not after everything she had been through. The court was tense, with the atmosphere charged with judgment and expectation. Lillian was trying to recompose herself, trying to get rid of the humiliation of her last outburst, but she felt that something was about to change. She looked at the faces around her, watching the gazes of the lawyers, those present and especially the judge. The weight of the room seemed to increase with every minute that passed, as if everyone there expected her to be guilty. She couldn't help but feel the pressure on her shoulders, as if her own breathing was being controlled by greater forces. It was then that the door opened with a low creak, interrupting the almost palpable silence that had taken over the courtroom. A young woman with a serious expression and an attentive gaze entered the room. Lillian immediately recognized the girl, her younger sister. She seemed nervous but determined, with an envelope firmly grasped in her hands. The sound of her quick steps echoed in the room as she approached the judge. Lillian felt her heart race. What was she doing there? What was happening? The young woman who worked at the courthouse approached the judge and with a slight hesitation handed him the envelope. "This envelope." "A girl handed it to me outside and said, 'It's relevant to the trial,'" said the young woman, her voice low but clear. The judge, with a look of surprise, carefully opened the envelope. The entire courtroom was in suspense, tension taking over the atmosphere. Lillian, even without fully understanding what was happening, felt a flame of hope ignite within her. Perhaps finally, the truth was being brought to light. The courtroom was in complete silence, the murmur of the audience disappearing as the tension in the air became palpable. The younger girl entered the room with an envelope in her hands, her steps hesitant but determined. Lillian watched her with anxious eyes, her heart racing. The young woman approached the judge and handed him the envelope with a firm motion. All eyes were on her, and the room, which had been charged with suspicion before, now seemed to await eagerly for what was about to be revealed. "This envelope contains something important," the girl said, her voice trembling but firm. The judge, with an impassive expression, opened the envelope and took out not only a note, but also recordings and photos, documents that until then no one imagined existed. The room was in suspense, everyone waiting for the judge to reveal the contents. Lillian felt a chill down her spine, but also hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The judge took the envelope that had been delivered to him by Maya, the young woman from the courthouse, and after quickly examining the contents, announced aloud, "I will read this out loud." He then began to read, and his words echoed through the room, provoking a tense and expectant silence. This note was written by Maya, Bruce's daughter. She says that it was her sister Vivian who hid the medallion and set everything up to incriminate Lillian. It was she who hid the necklace. She was afraid of being discovered, and so she made up the whole story to divert attention. Lillian stood motionless, words almost failing her. The truth was finally beginning to emerge, but anxiety still hung over her. The judge paused, looked at the documents in his hands, and then continued. These proofs not only confirm the statement in the note, but also contain photos and recordings that directly implicate Mrs. Vivian in the plot. The courtroom fell into complete silence, the revelation catching everyone by surprise. Lillian looked at Maya, who was standing by her side, with a look that mingled relief and sadness. The truth was being unmasked, and she felt a weight being lifted from her shoulders, but at the same time the tension of the situation still kept her on alert. Bruce and Vivian, who were observing from a distance, felt the impact of the reversal. They knew that control of the situation had slipped from their hands. The judge, with a pensive expression, paused before looking at Lillian. "This information completely alters the direction of the trial," he said, his voice grave. "However, we still need further investigation. We cannot draw hasty conclusions without full confirmation." Lillian swallowed hard, fear still gripping her. "What does this mean for me? What else needs to be investigated?" she asked, her voice faltering. The judge, while analyzing the documents once again, replied, "We need the police to conduct a full investigation at the mansion. Only then can we reach a final decision." The room was filled with murmurs, the lawyers exchanging incredulous looks. The tension grew, and Lillian felt the weight of uncertainty take over her body. She knew the battle wasn't won yet, but the truth now had a chance to be revealed. "Don't worry, Lillian," Maya, who had approached Lillian, spoke, her voice softly reassuring. "The truth is coming out. You're going to be okay." Lillian, her eyes brimming with tears, only replied, "I just want this to be over, but can I endure what's still to come?" The girl nodded with a shy smile, trying to convey confidence. "You'll make it. I know you will." The judge then raised his hand, interrupting the growing commotion in the room. "The police will be summoned immediately. We're going to get to the bottom of this once and for all." He turned to the officers present. "Go to the mansion, gather all the evidence, and bring it back as quickly as possible. We need the full truth." Lillian looked at the door, watching the officers prepare to leave. What would be found at the mansion? She knew the investigation could finally bring freedom, but she also feared what else might be revealed. With a last grateful look at Maya, who had given her this chance, Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength. The courtroom was in expectant silence, the future uncertain. Everything depended on what the police would find. The door opened again, and the officers rushed out, heading towards the mansion. Lillian felt as if time had stopped, awaiting the outcome. The judge gave her one last look before rising and leaving the courtroom, setting it in motion. Lillian knew she was not free yet. The real battle now was in the hands of the investigation. The police investigation was swift and intense. The officers who had been summoned returned with irrefutable evidence confirming Maya's statement. The next day, the elder sister was formally charged with fraud, theft, and witness tampering. The charges involved not only the theft of the medallion, but also the plot to frame Lillian and destroy her reputation. Vivian had orchestrated everything to make Lillian appear guilty. When the judge read the verdict, the murmurs in the courtroom were of disbelief and shock. The servant Lillian, who had been framed and humiliated throughout the process, now found herself at the center of a public scandal. The truth prevailed, Lillian murmured to herself, relief mingled with incredulity in the words. As the investigations deepened, members of Vivian's family were being pressured to publicly retract. Vivian, who had orchestrated the whole plot, had no way to escape the weight of the evidence. She was duly punished for her crimes. Lillian watched the scene from afar, still trying to understand the extent of everything that had happened. Maya, by her side, made no secret of her satisfaction with the way events had unfolded. "You always knew the truth would come out, Lillian." Now it's time for you to live your life. But Lillian still couldn't fully relax. Can I really live in peace now? She asked, her voice trembling. Will the pain go away? Meanwhile, the press was quick to cover the case. The scandal involving Vivian's betrayal and Lillian's suffering took over the news, and social media began to fill with messages of support for the woman who had been wrongfully accused. Many people began to question how society had allowed such injustice to be committed, while others stood up to support Lillian in her fight. The recovery of her reputation was slow, but the public's trust in her grew every day. In the midst of those chaotic days, Lillian received a letter. It was no ordinary letter, but a formal communication, an apology from Bruce's own family, who finally acknowledged the wrong they had done to her. Finally, Lillian thought, they see what they did to me. She felt a mix of anger and relief, but also an emptiness, knowing that nothing could erase what had happened. The judge, with a serious look, watched Lillian as she witnessed the family's public retraction. This is the last part, Lillian. Now you can move forward, he said, breaking the silence of the room. But the fear had not completely disappeared from her heart. What if they come back? What if there are more lies? She asked, her anxiety manifesting in her voice. The judge smiled softly. From now on, you have the support of the law and society. The truth is on your side. The relief Lillian felt was not immediate. She knew that the battle had been won, but the war against the shadows that haunted her life was far from over. In a move that seemed to symbolize the recovery of her life, Lillian received a significant compensation offer from the family that had caused her so much suffering. Although the amount was enormous, Lillian had no illusions about the money. It represented an acknowledgement of her pain and injustice, but also the opportunity to restart her life with dignity. With the support of the financial compensation, she bought a simple but cozy house. The property was on a quiet street, away from the hustle and bitter memories of the past. As she entered her new home for the first time, Lillian felt a wave of gratitude and a sense of renewal. This is the beginning, she thought. This is where I will build my future. The girl Lillian had such affection for, the younger sister Maya, now fully aware of the true story, was one of the first to visit her in her new home. She arrived with a shy smile and eyes shining with joy. I knew you'd make it, the girl said, hugging Lillian tightly. Now we're a team, aren't we? Lillian hugged her back, feeling the warmth and comfort of the young woman's presence. Yes, we are, she replied, her voice filled with emotion. She knew the girl saw her as a second mother, and Lillian felt that this emotional bond was what made her feel that she was finally rebuilding her life. With the custody of her child finally regained, Lillian felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. After months of legal and emotional battles, the court finally recognized her ability to be a mother, and the return of her child was the greatest victory she could achieve. The moment he ran towards her and hugged her tightly was indescribable. I'll protect you forever, she whispered in his ear, and he smiled, a genuine smile of happiness. That was the first time in a long while that Lillian truly felt at peace. With the house bought and debts resolved, Lillian finally found the peace she had been seeking. She looked for a job and soon found a vacancy in a small second-hand store. The work was not glamorous, but Lillian felt she was earning a living in an honest and dignified way. She was recognized by others for her ethics and perseverance, and soon became a respected employee. When the store owner asked her the reason for her great dedication, Lillian answered with a sincere smile, "Because now I know what it is to work for something worthwhile." The owner smiled, clearly touched. "You have an incredible strength, Lillian. I'm glad you're here." Time passed and Lillian found herself increasingly integrated into her new routine. The work in the store, although simple, brought her a sense of normalcy she never thought possible, after so many years of pain and suffering. With each customer she served with a genuine smile, she felt she was rebuilding her own confidence. Each payment she received, each small step towards financial independence, made her realize how much she had achieved. She looked at the store one day, at the end of her shift, and reflected on how much life had changed. This is enough. This is all I need, she thought gratefully. As the months went by, Lillian's emotional scars began to heal. She didn't let the past define her life, and with the support of Maya and the community that now saw her in a different light, she blossomed. The family that had destroyed her was distant, and the members of society who had once condemned her now saw her with respect. Lillian became a person others trusted, and who, with her own experience, inspired those going through similar difficulties. When Lillian's son was finally returned to her, the joy that filled her heart was indescribable. She hugged him tightly, promising herself that she would never again let anything separate them. "I will protect you forever," she whispered in his ear, and he smiled, a genuine smile of happiness. With her son back, Lillian's life seemed to finally stabilize. She prepared a small breakfast for him, and, as they talked about school and friends, her heart filled with simple, complete happiness. "I will never let you go again," she thought, looking at him fondly. But most importantly, she was rebuilding her life, and this time the foundations were firm. She knew there was still much to achieve, but the past no longer haunted her. "Now I am free," she said to herself with a calm she never thought she would achieve. Lillian never forgot her struggle, but she also never let it define her. She knew her life would be filled with challenges, but now she was ready to face them. "I am no longer a victim," she thought, looking at her home, her son, and the girl she considered her daughter. "I am a strong woman, and that's what they couldn't take away from me." When the girl visited her once more with a proud smile on her lips, Lillian hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for always being by my side. Now let's start what really matters." With Maya's support and the friendship she had cultivated over time, Lillian felt surrounded by a network of love and solidarity that further strengthened her. The girl who had come to see her as a mother was a reflection of everything Lillian had become. No longer the woman who had suffered, but the one who had rebuilt her own story with courage and determination. "I know how much you've grown," the girl said as she settled beside her on the couch. Lillian looked at her and smiled. "I just did what was necessary." The gentle wind passed through the open window, and Lillian, with a peaceful heart, knew her fresh start was real. She had faced the darkness and was now walking towards the light. Her life, rebuilt with dignity and strength, was the greatest proof that despite all adversities, love and truth would always prevail. Lillian had been lifted up, not only by others, but by herself. And now she was ready to take the next steps, certain that nothing could destroy her again. The peace she now possessed was the true reward for her perseverance and courage. A year had passed since Lillian and her son found peace. The house was now filled with laughter and simple yet precious moments. The late afternoon sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the small space where she and her son used to spend time together. They had become accustomed to the quiet routine, consisting of shared dinners, conversations about the day, and plans for the future. Life finally seemed balanced and full of hope. The bond between mother and son was stronger than ever. He excelled at school and was happier, his confidence growing with each passing day. Lillian watched this with pride, knowing she had been a fundamental part of this transformation. The time they spent together was the most precious reward for her. "I'm so glad to have you with me, my love," she said, smiling as he played with his new storybook. He looked at her with a broad smile. "Me too, Mom. Very much." Maya, who had become an inseparable friend of Lillian's, visited the house constantly. She always brought a smile and an encouraging word. Her presence was a constant reminder that kindness and friendship truly made a difference. With each visit, Maya brought news about how the community was doing, and Lillian, always eager, listened attentively. With each of these visits, the connection between them deepened, and together they looked to the future with optimism. "I always knew you'd make it," Maya would say, hugging Lillian. "You have an immense strength." On one of those peaceful days, a surprise arrived at the door. Bruce appeared, head bowed, visibly ashamed. Lillian fell silent for a moment, surprised by his presence. Bruce looked at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Lillian," he said, his voice choked. "But I come to apologize for everything I did. I know I caused you a lot of pain and I deeply regret it. What happened was wrong and I was blinded by anger and pride. I didn't see how much you were suffering." Lillian looked at him for a moment, her mind filled with memories of everything she had been through. But as she looked at her former boss, she no longer saw only the man who had wronged her. She saw someone who was finally recognizing his mistakes and trying to fix what was broken. "Bruce," she began, her voice soft, "I hold no grudge. What you did and what happened cannot be erased. but I can forgive you. We all make mistakes. What's important is what we do after we recognize them." Bruce looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to be so generous. He took a step forward, his expression full of gratitude. "You really forgive me?" he asked, his eyes welling up. Lillian nodded with a sad but sincere smile. "Yes, but only if you promise to do your best to be a better person, for yourself and for others. Forgiveness is not just a word, Bruce. It's a change in attitude." He knelt before her, tears in his eyes, and hugged her tightly. "I promise. I'll do everything I can to prove to you that I'm being sincere." With Lillian's forgiveness, a new phase for the family began. Bruce continued visiting them, seeking to redeem himself and start his life anew. The relationship between him and Lillian was still delicate, but there was a new mutual respect. Maya, ever attentive, supported this fresh start, encouraging them to move forward. "Sometimes you have to go back to move forward," Maya said once, when Lillian expressed her doubts about the future with Bruce. "But you have the power to decide what to do with what's left." With time, Lillian and her son continued living a peaceful and happy life. They were surrounded by love and support, rebuilding not only their own story, but also that of everyone around them. And despite the difficulties of the past, she knew that now the future was theirs to create. She looked at her son as he played, with Maya by his side, and knew with absolute certainty that the life she had regained was now fuller than she could ever have imagined. Every laugh of his filled the house with a joy that Lillian could hardly believe she would ever experience again. The mere sound of his voice, the sparkle in his eyes as he pointed to the sky, dreaming of what could be, made her feel that nothing else could take away the happiness they had built. The walls of the house, once so empty and filled with pain, now reflected a home full of warmth, friendship, and hope. The days were spent among the small moments of a familiar routine that, even simple, had immeasurable value. Lillian and her son shared breakfast while chatting about school, each other's stories, and even plans for the weekend. Maya, with her comforting presence, always brought something new, advice, a laugh, a reminder of how everything had changed for the better. Their friendship, now unbreakable, was a daily reminder that loyalty and support were the foundation for any new construction. The flowers in Lillian's little garden, tended with care, seemed to reflect what she felt. Something that was blossoming again, with vibrant colors, like a new beginning. She knew that over time, the traces of the past would become even more distant, and the life she had always dreamed of was now within her reach. Did you enjoy Lillian and Maya's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.